Kenya, 1985. During the key kiss scene in Out of Africa, Meryl Streep suddenly froze, tears running down her face. She whispered that she couldn't do it. The entire crew went silent. Then Robert Redford leaned in, said 7 quiet words, and everything about the scene changed forever. Before Kenya, before the cameras, before the moment she froze in front of Robert Redford, Meryl Streep carried a history most people never saw. On screen, she was the definition of excellence. The actress who transformed herself completely, who vanished into every role, who never missed a beat. At just 35, she had already earned what others spent entire careers chasing. 1 Oscar. 4 nominations. Performances critics called flawless, legendary, impossible to imitate. But perfection is rarely peaceful. Behind the applause, behind the articles praising her discipline and range, Meryl lived with an expectation so heavy it followed her into every room. She could not fail. Not once. Not ever. Directors trusted her to save difficult scenes. Studios counted on her to elevate troubled productions. Audiences worshipped her as if she were untouchable. And somewhere along the way, without noticing, Meryl internalized all of it. Every compliment became a quiet rule. Every success became a new standard. She lived inside a cage built from praise. But the real weight she carried did not come from Hollywood. It came from a hospital room in New York 7 years earlier. In 1978, Meryl Streep was not an icon. She was a young actress in love with John Cazale, a man whose talent was so precise, so intimate, that every director he worked with called him irreplaceable. He had been in 5 films, and all 5 would become classics. The Godfather, The Conversation, Dog Day Afternoon, The Deer Hunter. His craft was quiet brilliance, unforgettable without ever demanding attention. Meryl met him doing Shakespeare in the Park. He made her laugh. He made her think. He made her feel safe. And then, in the middle of shooting The Deer Hunter, he could no longer hide the pain in his chest. Lung cancer, the doctors said. Aggressive. Unforgiving. Meryl stayed with him through everything. Through the treatments. Through the fading strength. Through the days when he could barely speak. She sat beside him, memorizing the rhythm of his breathing, terrified of the day it would stop. And when he died in March 1978, something inside her collapsed. Not loudly. Silently. She did not scream. She did not break down in front of anyone. Instead, she built walls so high no one could climb them. Work became the only place she didn't have to feel. Performance became armor. 6 months later, she married Don Gummer. Good, steady, reliable Don. He offered stability, devotion, and a future she could trust. But grief does not disappear just because a new chapter begins. It burrows deep. It waits. Meryl became a mother. 3 children in 7 years. She loved them fiercely, but love came with guilt. Every time she boarded a plane for a role, she heard tiny voices asking when she would come home. And yet she kept working, kept accepting demanding characters, kept proving to the world that she could handle anything. But she never handled John's absence. Not really. She simply outran it. Until Out of Africa forced her to stop. The role of Karen Blixen required more than technique. It required surrender, an openness Meryl had avoided since the day she lost John. Karen was a woman who loved deeply, who risked everything, who allowed herself to be vulnerable, and who paid for it with heartbreak. In the script, Karen loses Dennis in a plane crash. And Meryl, reading those pages, felt an echo she wasn't ready to confront. She told herself it was fine. She told herself it was just acting. But grief recognizes grief. And then there was Redford. He was older, calm, grounded. A man who carried his own history quietly, who understood emotion without needing to name it. His presence was steady, almost disarming. When he looked at her during scenes, he didn't see the iconic actress, the Hollywood miracle. He saw the human being underneath. That was the danger. Because the walls Meryl built were designed to keep people from seeing exactly that. The fear she carried was simple, but enormous. If she opened the door, even a little, everything she'd buried would rush out. Grief, guilt, loneliness. The pressure of being perfect for everyone, her directors, her critics, her children, her husband. She had spent 7 years holding everything together with discipline. And now this film, this landscape, this love story, threatened to undo her. So when the kiss scene approached, the moment Karen Blixen falls fully, helplessly in love. Meryl felt the walls inside her crack. Not because of Redford, not because of the script, but because she sensed what acting that moment truthfully would cost her. It would require her to feel again, to remember again, to stop running. In Africa, surrounded by vast land and merciless skies, Meryl carried a weight no one saw. A weight that made one simple kiss impossible, until the moment she finally broke. When Meryl arrived in Kenya, the heat hit her first, a dry, bright warmth that felt different from anything she had known. The light was sharper. The air smelled of dust, grass, and distant smoke. The land seemed endless, stretching in every direction like a place where secrets could hide forever. She stepped out of the Jeep, still jet-lagged, still holding herself tight, and found Robert Redford waiting near the tents. He didn't approach immediately. He just watched her. There was something steady in the way he stood, shoulders relaxed, hands in his pockets, as if he understood that she needed a moment to absorb everything. Most actors rushed into introductions. Redford didn't. He let the silence do the work. When she finally walked toward him, their first exchange was simple. "Welcome to Africa," he said. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest. And strangely, that honesty unsettled her. She'd worked with brilliant actors, demanding actors, ambitious actors. But Redford carried a quietness that felt like a mirror, reflecting back what she didn't want to see. Exhaustion, vulnerability, the heaviness beneath her calm professionalism. He wasn't looking at Meryl Streep. He was looking at her. She smiled politely, the kind of smile she used at award shows and press junkets, a smile built for survival. Redford noticed, and for a second, something gentle passed through his eyes. Not pity, recognition. Because Redford had been through his own fractures, his own losses. He knew the look of someone holding too much. Sidney Pollack called them over for early rehearsals. It wasn't a scene, just a conversation about characters, tone, the emotional heartbeat of the film. They sat at a wooden table under a canvas awning, scripts open but barely touched. Sidney talked. Redford listened. Meryl observed. Even in silence, the dynamic between them began to form. Redford responded thoughtfully, always choosing the simplest words. Meryl answered with precision, each sentence polished. Two different energies, his calm, hers sharpened, yet somehow they fit. At one point, Sidney asked them to stand and try the first blocking exercise. No dialogue, just movement. A simple approach and retreat. Redford stepped forward. Meryl stepped back. It wasn't planned. Her body simply reacted. Too close. Too personal. Too soon. Even she didn't understand why. "Let's try again," Sidney said. They reset. This time Meryl stepped forward. Redford didn't move. He held his position, not dominating, not challenging, just steady enough that she had to decide whether to hold her ground or retreat. She stayed. Barely, but she stayed. Later, in her tent, she wrote in her journal, "There is something about him. Something I can't read yet." Over the next few days, she watched him on set. He treated crew members with the same respect he gave established actors. He listened more than he spoke. He never raised his voice. He never pushed himself forward. And that restraint made him magnetic. The first real spark happened during a costume test. Meryl walked onto the set wearing Karen Blixen's early morning outfit. Loose blouse, practical skirt, a scarf tied at her neck. Her hair was pulled back, no makeup except for the bare minimum. Redford looked up, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Not admiration, recognition, as if seeing a version of Karen he'd been waiting for. The cameraman captured the moment, Meryl stepping into the light, Redford watching from across the room. The shot wouldn't make it into the film, but something invisible did. The first trace of chemistry, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that grows in the quiet spaces between words. During breaks, they talked, not about the roles, but about small things. Books, music, the heat, the strange silence of African nights. Redford asked questions that didn't feel intrusive. Meryl answered cautiously at first, then more freely. She didn't tell him about John. She didn't tell him about the guilt, the pressure, the fear. But she didn't have to. Redford had an unnerving habit of listening, as if he could hear the things she wasn't saying. One evening, while the sky turned the color of burnt copper, they watched a herd of elephants move across the plains. Redford said quietly, "This place strips everything down. It leaves only what's true." Meryl felt a chill, Not from the wind, but from the accuracy of his words. Because that was the danger of Kenya. The vastness made it harder to hide. Redford became the one presence she couldn't evade, calm enough to touch the edges of her guardedness, patient enough to wait without pushing. Without meaning to, he reflected the vulnerability she tried to bury. She didn't know it yet, but this connection, the quiet, steady one building between them, would become the crack that let everything through. The crack that would eventually shatter during the kiss scene. Sometimes, the person who changes everything doesn't break down the door. They simply stand there, steady, gentle, unafraid, and wait for you to open it. In the early weeks of filming, Meryl moved through her scenes with the precision everyone expected. She hit every mark. She delivered every line with quiet force. She transformed into Karen Blixen so completely that even the crew stopped seeing Meryl Streep and saw only the character. And yet, something inside her had begun to shift. It started subtly. A longer pause before a line. A breath that trembled instead of flowing smoothly. A moment when she looked at Redford not as a scene partner, but as someone who saw too much. Nobody noticed. Except Redford. He didn't say anything. He didn't point it out. But whenever her voice caught, his eyes softened. Whenever she hesitated, he waited. Whenever the director called cut, he lingered a moment longer, as if giving her permission to take one extra breath. It was enough to unsettle her. Because Meryl wasn't used to being seen. Not fully. Not beyond the craft. The more they filmed, the more Karen Blixen's world seeped into her own. Scenes of loneliness, of responsibility, of quiet longing. Scenes of a woman holding an entire life together with nothing but pride and willpower. Meryl felt the overlap. Karen wasn't just a character anymore. She was a reflection. One afternoon, they filmed a simple moment. Karen tending to the farm, watching Dennis from a distance. No dialogue. Just silent observation. The kind of scene directors love because it reveals everything without saying anything. When the camera rolled, Meryl felt an unfamiliar tightening in her chest. She watched Redford adjust a saddle, his movements easy, unforced. The sun hit his hair, turning it into a pale gold. The simplicity of it all, the peace, the warmth, the steadiness, felt like an accusation. Karen longed for connection. Meryl longed for rest. The camera pushed in. Meryl's breath broke. It wasn't dramatic. Just a tiny fracture. But Redford saw it instantly. Between takes, he approached quietly. "You good?" he asked. A simple question. Too simple. The kind that feels safe only until you try to answer. "I'm fine," she said. Too quickly. He didn't challenge her, but she caught the way he watched her walk back to her mark. Not with concern, but with understanding. That was the moment she realized he could see the cracks forming. And that terrified her. Because Meryl had survived the past 7 years by being unbreakable. By choosing control over chaos. Discipline over vulnerability. Silence over grief. But Africa had a way of eroding defenses. The vast skies. The stillness of nights. The endless distance where thoughts echoed too loudly. And then came the scenes that touched too close to home. Scenes where Karen confronts her own loneliness. Scenes where she admits she cannot force Dennis to stay. Scenes where love becomes both salvation and threat. Every time Meryl stepped into those moments, she felt something inside her loosen, just a little. She told herself it was the heat, the schedule, the exhaustion, anything but the truth. Until the night Sidney Pollack noticed it. They were reviewing dailies. Close-ups of Meryl. Close-ups of Redford. Small scenes meant to build the romance. Sidney leaned forward, studying one of Meryl's takes. A moment where Karen watches Dennis ride away. "Something's happening here," he said quietly. Meryl froze. Redford glanced at her. "It's good," Sidney added. "It's honest. It's vulnerable." The word landed like a blow. Vulnerable. The very thing Meryl had spent years avoiding. The very thing she wasn't sure she could survive feeling again. She excused herself early that night. Stepped outside the tent. Looked at the sky, black and enormous and impossibly silent. And for the first time, she felt it clearly. The wall she'd built around her grief was thinning. Africa was doing it. Karen was doing it. Redford was doing it. The combination was dangerous. Because vulnerability, once invited, doesn't ask permission to stay. The next morning, during rehearsal for the upcoming kiss scene, Meryl felt the tremor before it happened. That quiet panic rising beneath her ribs. She tried to ignore it. She tried to breathe through it. But the truth was simple. Karen needed to fall in love. And Meryl wasn't ready for what that meant. Not for the character. For herself. The cracking wall was no longer metaphor. It was real. It was coming apart. And in a matter of days, it would break completely. Because some emotions can be buried for years. But they never forget how to surface. The morning of the kiss scene began quietly, almost too quietly. Kenya was wrapped in a pale, early light, the kind that makes the world look softer than it really is. Meryl woke before her alarm, heart beating faster than usual. She lay still for a moment, staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, listening to the distant sound of birds and the gentle crackle of a kerosene lamp outside. She already knew something was wrong. She felt it the way a body feels an approaching storm. She dressed carefully, tying her hair back with steady hands that did not feel steady. She practiced her lines, though the scene barely had any. She reminded herself it was just another moment. Just another character. Just another day. But deep down, she knew the lie in that thought. This was the scene where Karen Blixen finally lets love in. Not cautiously, not politely, but completely. And to play it truthfully, Meryl would have to cross a line she hadn't crossed since John died. A line she'd kept locked behind years of discipline and work. When she reached the set, Redford was already there. He stood by the window of Karen's house, adjusting the cuff of his shirt, sunlight brushing his shoulder. He looked up when she walked in, offering the same familiar, steady smile. Not probing, not demanding, just present. "You ready?" he asked softly. Meryl nodded. She wasn't. Not even close. Sidney Pollack walked them through the blocking one last time. It was simple. Talk, walk, silence, kiss. No choreography. No technical complications. Sidney wanted the moment to feel spontaneous, unforced, real. "We'll keep the crew minimal," he said. "Just a skeleton team. No pressure." But pressure doesn't come from the number of people in a room. It comes from the things you're afraid to feel. They took their places. Sidney stepped back. The camera operator lifted the slate. Action. The scene began smoothly. Meryl moved through her lines with precision, her Danish accent flowing easily. Redford responded with quiet warmth, grounding the moment. Their characters drifted closer in the silence that followed. And then, the moment when the script said simply, "They kiss." Meryl lifted her eyes to Redford, expecting to step forward, expecting her body to follow the choreography. But something inside her snapped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't visible to anyone else at first. Just a sudden, cold paralysis locking her in place. Her breath caught. Her chest tightened. Her throat burned. Redford's expression softened instantly. "Meryl?" he whispered, still in character but unmistakably concerned. She tried to speak. Only 2 words came out. "I can't." Sidney didn't hear it. He thought it was part of the scene. "Stay with it," he said from behind the monitor. "This is good." But Meryl shook her head, a tiny, defeated motion that broke the illusion completely. "I can't do this." The room shifted. The sound recorder lowered his boom. The camera operator hesitated but didn't stop. Everyone went silent. Meryl's eyes filled with tears she had no control over. Not the crafted tears of an actress. Not the subtle tremble of a performance. These were tears from somewhere older. Somewhere deeper. Somewhere she had kept locked away for 7 years. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She couldn't pretend anymore. Redford crossed the room quietly, slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask questions. He simply stood close enough that she could hear him, close enough that the space around her felt less terrifying. Sidney whispered, "Cut," trying to give her privacy. But Redford didn't take his eyes off her. "No," he said gently. "Keep rolling." The camera stayed on. Meryl closed her eyes, tears spilling down her face. The room felt unbearably small. The heat of Kenya pressed against her skin. Her ribs tightened with every breath. She whispered again, almost ashamed, "I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening." But she did. She knew exactly what was happening. The wall she had built after John died, the wall that had protected her, imprisoned her, and shaped her, was breaking. Redford stepped closer. His voice was barely audible. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said. "Let her be strong." 7 words. Simple. Precise. True. The words slipped past her defenses like a key into a lock. Something inside her gave way, not violently, but inevitably, like ice melting under the sun. Meryl's shoulders trembled. Her breath cracked. Her grief surfaced, raw, unfiltered, merciless. She wasn't crying for the scene. She was crying for John. For the years she spent pretending she was fine. For the fear of failing her children. For the exhaustion of being perfect. For everything she had never allowed herself to feel. Redford watched it all, not afraid, not overwhelmed. Just present. Just steady. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked at him. Not as Meryl, not as the actress, but as Karen Blixen, the woman who had lost so much and still dared to love again. And she kissed him. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't crafted for the camera. It was a breaking open, a letting go, a surrender. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled. Her breath hitched against his mouth. Redford held her gently, grounding her, anchoring her in the moment, allowing the scene to carry what she could not carry alone. Sydney didn't say a word. He didn't direct. He didn't interrupt. He understood exactly what he was witnessing. This was not acting. This was truth. When the kiss ended, Meryl stumbled back a step, shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. "Don't be," Redford replied quietly. That was real. And Sydney finally spoke. Cut. The crew remained frozen, unsure whether to applaud, breathe, or look away. Because some moments are not meant to be witnessed. But once they are, they change everything. After the kiss scene, the set fell into a strange, reverent quiet. No one rushed to reset the lights or adjust the camera. No one dared make a joke or break the moment. It was as if the air itself had thickened, as if everyone knew they had witnessed something they weren't supposed to, something too raw, too human, too private. Meryl stepped outside first. The sun was at its highest point, bright and unforgiving. She shielded her eyes with her hand, breathing in the sharp scent of dry grass and warm dust. Her chest still trembled from the release she couldn't control. She wasn't sure if she wanted to cry more or sleep for a week. Behind her, footsteps approached softly. Redford. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood beside her, leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel crowded, close enough so she wouldn't feel alone. For a long moment, they watched the Kenyan landscape stretch endlessly toward the horizon. "You okay?" he finally asked. Meryl wiped her face with the back of her hand, a small, almost embarrassed gesture. "I don't know," she said truthfully. Redford nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "Yes, you do," he said gently. And she did. The scene had pulled grief up from the deepest part of her, grief she'd refused to acknowledge, grief she'd locked away because feeling it again felt too dangerous. But now the door was open, and there was no closing it quickly. She hesitated, then said quietly, "I lost someone. Years ago. I never dealt with it. I just worked. And this scene, this character, she's about to lose everything too. I think I couldn't separate myself from her." Redford's voice was calm, steady. "You're not supposed to." Meryl let out a small, tired laugh, half disbelief, half relief. "I'm supposed to be in control," she said. "Says who?" Redford asked, not unkindly. She didn't have an answer. They stood in silence again. The wind picked up, brushing against the canvas tents, stirring the dirt at their feet. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called out, low, mournful, like an echo of the emotions she had just released. When she returned to the set, something inside her had shifted. Not broken, shifted. She stopped forcing herself to be perfect. She stopped treating every emotion like a threat. She let the character carry some of the weight. She let Redford support her when she needed grounding. She let herself breathe. And the work changed. Their scenes became more fluid, more connected. The chemistry that audiences would later praise wasn't performance, it was recognition. Two people who knew the cost of grief. Two people who understood what it meant to hold everything together for years. Two people who finally stopped pretending. Sydney noticed it immediately. He didn't need to over-direct. He didn't need multiple takes. He simply let the camera roll, trusting whatever was happening between them to guide the scene. When they filmed Dennis's death, Meryl's grief was so real that the crew went silent again. She wasn't crying for Karen alone. She was crying for John, for the years she lost, for the parts of herself she'd buried. The scene was devastating and beautiful. Because it wasn't acting. It was release. By the time filming wrapped in May, Meryl wasn't the same woman who had stepped onto that set months earlier. The work hadn't healed her, but it had opened a door. It had reminded her she didn't have to hold everything alone. And sometimes, that reminder is enough to change the course of a life. When Out of Africa finally premiered in December 1985, Audiences fell in love with its sweeping landscapes, its quiet romance, its gentle lake. Critics called it timeless. The Academy called it a masterpiece. 11 nominations, 7 wins. And at the heart of it, they said, was the chemistry, the impossible-to-replicate connection between Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. But what the world praised as chemistry was something else entirely. It was truth, born in a moment no one was meant to see. Meryl never spoke publicly about what happened that day in Kenya. Not in interviews, not in retrospectives, not in award season profiles. She always credited Sidney Pollack's direction, the beauty of the script, or the magic of the Kenyan landscape. Never the breakdown, never the tears, never the 7 whispered words. Because some moments do not belong to Hollywood. They belong to the people who survived them. Months after filming ended, Meryl wrote Redford a letter. Not long, not poetic, just honest. She thanked him for being there that day, for not stepping back, for not filling the silence, for not demanding strength she no longer had. Redford wrote back with a sentence she kept for years. You did the hard part. I just reminded you of what you already knew. As time passed, that moment didn't fade. It became part of her craft, the hidden foundation of every performance where she allowed herself to be imperfect, flawed, human. It taught her that vulnerability is not weakness, that control is not survival, that grief, when finally acknowledged, can become a kind of quiet strength. Decades later, in an interview about acting, she said, I learned that letting someone help you doesn't diminish you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't carry everything alone. She didn't mention Kenya. She didn't mention Redford. She didn't mention what broke her open and stitched her back together in the same breath. She didn't need to, because the legacy of that moment lives in the scene itself, in the trembling breath before the kiss, the tears she didn't plan, the way she leaned into the emotion instead of away from it. Acting students still study it today. Directors still reference it. Viewers still feel it, even if they don't know why. And maybe that's the true miracle. That a private crack in someone's heart, captured accidentally on camera, became one of the most honest moments in Hollywood history. Sometimes, the greatest art begins with 7 quiet words, and the courage to finally let them in.